So welcome again to this morning's joint network session. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Scientists Network, because actually we are the ones to have had this idea, and we are very thankful for the other networks and for the organizers to have enabled this occasion. I welcome you on behalf of Alexander Fink, who everybody I think knows, and myself. My name is Peter. We co-direct the Scientists Network. As for myself, I'm a chemist. I've got a research professorship in medicinal chemistry in a German university. So it's a 4 networks joint session. It's become such a session by design, and I hope it will evolve into something useful. Let me begin by very quickly stating the common platform that we have. The common platform, of course, is an awesome God who is our great creator and savior. So I would like to start out with a scripture we've selected for this morning. The Scientist Network always has a scripture for the day, for the morning. The scripture for today is from Job, from the book of Job, chapter 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy." So the topic that we have before us, something related to creation, means that we are kind of perhaps going to stand in wonder and in awe, looking at God's creation. And He's the one who asks the questions and who knows the answers. But we are the ones who want to know as much as we can, as much as He grants to us to know, through the scriptures and through science. So our common platform is this God, this Savior, this faith in the scriptures, and in the context of the creation, a subject, a literal Adam. That's stated in the forums, outlines that faith, to believe in that there was a literal Adam and Eve, is a common platform from where the diversities arise. So we're going to have a diverse approach this morning, diverse in that it's 4 networks: theologians, philosophers, apologetics, scientists. That's diverse, and I trust very helpful. And there is also a diversity of approaches regarding the precise understanding that we have of how ourselves and the world came about. We have among us, which is great, young earth creationists, old earth creationists, ID people, intelligent design people, people who would advocate as Christian theistic evolution, and I believe people in between and people who are not quite sure. So what we want to do is engage in respectful debate. So my next thanks are due to Art Louie and Meyer, who I would like you to help me welcome you this morning. This is a rather unique occasion because they're going to present 2 different standpoints of view regarding creation mode, approach to science and creation. And I think, as far as I know, this is rather unique. And I'm very thankful to both of you and to all of us and to our God that He is enabling this. I don't really want to read the professional biographies of both speakers to us, because I trust you all have that in your notes. They are both well-known people in science and in speaking about these subjects, more than just in their respective countries. They're really very well-known people and very versed in what we're going to have before us. So the subject title of the debate is somewhat long. has been designed through an iterative process. Where do complex biological systems come from? A comparison of two different Christian approaches to creation. The two different approaches, if I may simplify a little bit, will be theistic evolution versus intelligent design. And you'll have to find out for yourself who of the two gentlemen is going to advocate which position. Let me quickly restate the schedule for this morning. You all have it before you. After this welcome, Stephen Meyer is going to have 25 minutes to give a presentation on his views, on his approach, to be followed more or less directly by Art Louie's 25 minutes presentation. After that, we will have about 30 minutes of a moderated panel discussion of the two speakers. So before the coffee break, I'd like to ask you to just listen, take notes, prepare questions, which you'll be enabled to ask after the coffee break. This moderated panel discussion will be moderated by myself, as I've been chosen to chair this event. I will say a little bit more on the type of moderation when the panel discussion starts, and I would like to explain a little bit on how I would like to run the plenary discussion after the coffee break. But I think for the moment I would just like to say a prayer to really begin our session, and then quickly hand over to our first speaker. So let's pray.
You talked about the common platform we share. It's interesting that we share a common platform or perspective, even with people who are atheists in the perception of biology. It's very commonly understood by biologists that living organisms look as though they were designed for a purpose. Richard Dawkins here says that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And I think that this quote is apropos for our discussion today, because we're going to be looking at complicated things, or rather the topic of biological complexity, and how best should we understand it and understand its origins. Of course, Dawkins represents the classical neo-Darwinian view that though things look as though they were designed for a purpose, that appearance of design is an illusion. And it's an illusion because, in his view, a purely unguided, undirected, mindless process of natural selection acting on random mutations has produced that appearance. And so I want to open today by framing my remarks and in a sense, the discussion, relating this to the discussion that will follow. We're going to be talking about the origin of complexity. So here's a question. Do standard, non-teleological, i.e. materialistic versions of evolutionary theory, such as those that Richard Dawkins represents, explain the origin of biological complexity? Or is there evidence that a purposive intelligence played a role? Now, Art and I may think differently about how to conceive of that, but I want to frame this in relation to the atheistic neo-Darwinists who have dominated the discussion and ask the question about complexity in these terms. Is it does a non-teleological account of evolution explain the complexity we see, or does purposes of intelligence need to play some role? Now, when we're talking about biological complexity, we could be talking about a lot of different things. We could be talking about, for example, the distinctive arrangement of organs and tissues that constitute what biologists call animal body plans. And I'm particularly interested in this right now. I've just written a book on the Cambrian explosion. And when we have many examples of body plans, but the interesting thing about a body plan is that it's really an integrated structure involving many disparate parts that fit together into a functioning whole. Now, we could also be talking about the individual parts or organs, the tissues, the different cell types that constitute an animal body plan, such as, for example, the compound eye that we find in insects, or that have been found in fossilized trilobites from the very dawn of animal life. Or we could be talking at a different level about the genetic circuitry that's required for animal body plans to develop properly. This is a fascinating area of study in developmental biology, And the slide on the screen actually shows a circuit that has been drawn to depict the way in which specific genes and signaling molecules interact with each other to form integrated circuits that control and direct cell differentiation and organization during the process of animal development from fertilized egg to adult animal. It's a fascinating area of study and another one that has revealed great complexity in life. Another area of complexity that we see in biology is a fascinating area, not about how cells are organized, but these are structures within cells called molecular machines, and there are many fascinating examples of these. I have slides showing two famous examples. The ATP synthase, which is an energy-generating turbine that operates on a nanoscale in the walls of mitochondria, and which produces the ATP molecules that store the information that drive all metabolic reactions inside the cell. These machines function on the same principle as a hydroelectric dam, but instead of the turbine being driven by a flow of water, they're driven by a flow of ions. And many of us are familiar with the bacterial flagellar motor, a rotary engine, again on a nanoscale, with bushings, drive shafts, stator, universal joint, and a whip-like propeller that drives the bacterium through liquid, chasing down its food, detecting changes in sugar gradient. Fascinating, high technology, low life. So fascinating types of complexity that we can talk about. But when we're talking about all forms of biological complexity, inevitably we must repair to the molecular level. In this bacterial flagellar motor, for example, if you keep your eye on that universal joint, now watch me change the slide, you see that that universal joint is actually made of a precisely sequenced arrangement of amino acids forming a protein. The universal joint is a protein part, and many structural parts of molecular machines, most parts, are made of proteins. And proteins are, in fact, the most important functional molecules at a biochemical level because they do all the important jobs in the cell. They form structural parts of machines, they help process genetic information, and they catalyze important reactions inside the cell that keep us alive, and all cells alive. But if we go an even deeper level, we know that proteins are synthesized on the basis of the instructions that are stored in the DNA molecule. And these instructions are a form of complexity, and it is this form of complexity that I want to address today. Because if we step back just a bit and realize that all the forms of complexity I've been talking about depend on proteins, and the proteins are constructed from the information in DNA, we realize the centrality of information, of genetic information, to understanding the complexity that we see in life. And we also realize that to explain the origin of complexity, we have to explain, at the very least, the origin of the genetic information that's stored in the DNA molecule. A quick aside, I don't want to imply that all the information that's involved in life is in DNA. We now have a whole new field of epigenetics, which is also a fascinating aspect of this discussion. But the genetic information is a necessary condition of all other forms of complexity. And for that reason, I want to focus my remarks on that today. So, a list of 7 forms of complexity. I'm going to focus on the 7th item in the list. Now, the origin of genetic information is a question that intersects evolutionary biology in 2 contexts. There are 2 forms of evolutionary theory. There is the classical biological evolutionary theory, which attempts to explain the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms. And then there is chemical evolutionary theory, which I've actually listed first on this list of 2, which addresses the question of the origin of the first life from simpler pre-existing chemicals. As it happens, I've written books about the origin of information in both of these 2 contexts, but I want to address my remarks today in the interest of time to the first of the 2, because in some sense it's the most fundamental question. How did the information necessary to produce life at all, life in the first place, arise? Now, when I was a college professor, I used to ask my students, if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And if I pause for a minute, you might call back to me, but I won't treat you like college freshmen. So, and obviously the answers would come, code, information, a program, etc. And they're all correct. And it turns out that the same thing is true in life. If we want to build a new animal from a pre-existing animal form, we need new information, and much of that information is genetic in form that needs to be provided by the evolutionary process. But if we want to build life in the first place from simply pre-existing chemicals, we also need information, in part, or in very significant measure, to account for and to build those proteins that are necessary for life to arise. Now, I first encountered this question of the origin of information in the context of discussions about the origin of life. And at this point, I would like to step back a little from a formal presentation and just let you know that I plan to speak from this point forward a little bit autobiographically, and I do that for a couple of reasons. One, we're in a debate setting here, but I know that neither Art nor I are here to score debating points and trying to win an argument at the expense of the other. And I found out last night that he had structured his remarks in much the same way, of explaining his own position. And that's what I want to do going forward, is explain a little bit autobiographically how I've come to the view that I now hold. Someone once asked me, how's a reasonably intelligent guy like you associated with such a disreputable idea as intelligent design? And so what I want to do going forward is, in a sense, explain how I came to hold that disreputable idea. So I first encountered this question of the origin of information in context of a discussion with a scientist named Charles Thatcher, who had written a book called The Mystery of Life's Origin, which was about the origin of life problem. And he gave a very compelling chapter and verse critique of the various theories that had been put forward. And I found, in talking to him and reading his book and getting fascinated with this topic, that the central problem in origin of life biology was this problem of the origin of information. And various different models had each come to a point of impasse because they were unable to give a satisfactory account of the information necessary to build life. I later then, after meeting this professor in my mid-20s, went to do a doctorate in England and in the history and philosophy of science. I ended up doing a dissertation on the question of the origin of life and the history and scientific issues in origin of life biology. And so I became fascinated with this. I came out of a background in physics and geology. I was doing digital signal processing for an oil company, which was an early form of information technology. And the idea that information was central to this fundamental mystery at the intersection of science and philosophy absolutely captured my imagination. And so one of the first things I wanted to explore in my doctoral studies was exactly what, when we're talking about information inside life, what kind of information are we talking about? As a quantitative scientist, I was aware of the definition of the information theory, the theory of Claude Shannon. But biology, it turns out, has a different kind of information than just the mathematical measures of improbability that are provided by Shannon's theory. And I started studying molecular biology to get to the bottom of this in my own mind. And what I discovered was that after Watson and Crick made their famous discovery of the structure of the DNA molecule in 1953, Crick had a brilliant insight that he formalized as a conjecture or a hypothesis that was called the sequence hypothesis. And what he proposed was that the four chemicals down the spine of the DNA molecule, the interior of subunits of the DNA called nucleotide bases, that these nucleotide bases function like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in machine code. Some MIT engineers very soon after said that the structure of the information in DNA was typographic. Now, that led to an understanding of the nature of the information as being not just complex, but complex in a very particular way. That is to say, what Crick was saying is that what makes DNA special, what allows it to function as an information carrier that has instructions for directing the synthesis of proteins, is that those nucleotide bases are arranged in a very particular way. Just as in computer code or a written language, the arrangement of the characters is crucial to the function that the sequence performs. The same is true in DNA. And so the DNA molecule does not just have complexity in the brute sense of a series of characters that defy a simple ordered pattern. But the arrangement of characters in the DNA have a particular kind of complexity that we could call specified complexity, where the arrangement is crucial to the function. And this distinguishes the information in DNA, for those who are engineers and mathematicians, from the common understanding of information provided by information theory, the information theory of Claude Shannon, where information is merely a measure of the improbability of a sequence of characters. The string on the top is highly improbable, but it has no function, it conveys no meaning. The string on the bottom, however, is highly improbable, and it conveys meaning. It performs a biological function, or in this case, a linguistic function. And this was the first question I had to get settled in my mind. What kind of information do we have in DNA? We have functional information. We have specified complexity, not just brute complexity. And Crick himself, who was always at the forefront of these discoveries, made this clear in 1958, very much aware of the Shannon theory. He said, the information in DNA is not merely Shannon information. He said, by information, he said, I mean the precise determination of sequence, either of bases in the nucleic acids or amino acid residues in the protein. So that was the first thing. And that's when we understand the kind of information that's in DNA, that explains statements like those by Richard Dawkins or Bill Gates, who say that the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Gates says the DNA is like a computer program, but more complex than any we've ever created. So that in a sense defined what needed to be explained in origin of life research. And I was aware that there was an impasse in the field, but I wanted to know how deep that impasse was. Why was this information problem so difficult? And there were two problems that came to my attention as I got into the literature that explained to me why this was such a difficult problem. The first is called the problem of combinatorial inflation, and that's a mouthful, but I can explain that very simply with a picture of a bike clock. If you look at a bike clock, you realize that there are, and this one has 4 dials with 10 digits in each. You might be tempted to think that that means there are 40 possible combinations, but if we think a little more closely, we realize it's not 10 plus 10 plus 10 combinations. It's 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 combinations, or 10,000. The number of combinations increases exponentially with the number of dials. So no one sells locks like this, but I had our artists create one. If we have a bike clock with 10 dials, we have 10 billion combinations, 10 to the 10th possibilities. Now, both genes and protein, and I notice what's happening to the number of combinations as you increase each dial. They're increasing or inflating exponentially, okay? So, if you're a bike thief and you want to steal a lock, and you have or steal a bike, and you encounter one with a bike with a lock like this and one like this, you don't have to have a degree in math to decide which one to try, right? And if you're encountering one that has a 10 to the 10 possibilities, and you say there's a security guard coming around the corner and you've only got 30 seconds, is it more likely than not or less likely than not that you're going to sample enough combinations to have a reasonable chance of opening the lock by chance? It's obviously overwhelmingly less likely than not. Now, origin of life biologists came to the same conclusion about the chance hypothesis with respect to the origin of functional genes and proteins. And for much the same reason, because genes and proteins are also subject to this problem of combinatorial inflation. There are 20 protein-forming amino acids. If we have a string with 10, a short peptide chain with 10, that represents there are 20 to the 10th alternative possibilities represented by that system. But if we go out a little longer and try to generate even a modest length protein, what we end up with is a sequence with a modest length protein of, say, 150 amino acids. Proteins are on average about 300 amino acids. We have 10 to the 195th possibilities, 20 to the 150th power. Now, not every one of those, in the case of proteins, there's not just one combination that will perform a function, but even taking all the combinations that do perform functions into account, we still have a situation very much like the one our thief encounters with a 10-dial lock. There are so many combinations to sample in relation to the few that will open the lock that chance alone is not going to adequately sample that space of possibilities. And for reasons very much along this line, leading origin of life biologists from the 1960s onward have pretty much rejected, in fact, I would say categorically, have completely rejected the chance hypothesis. Karen Smith here says that blind chance is very limited. It might be able to produce a few functional sequences, very short sequences, but as the length of the necessary sequences increases, forget it. It ain't going to happen because of this combinatorial problem. Now, there's a second problem that's made this origin of information problem especially acute, and it's the problem that information is not reducible to physics and chemistry. And this is, in a sense, a more profound problem. Now, this was first pointed out, and also pointed out about the information in DNA by the famous Hungarian physical chemist Michael Polanyi. And he noted that, he says, it's the arrangement in a printed page is extraneous to the chemistry of the printed page. In other words, information on a book is not the product of the chemistry of ink binding the paper. He said, so is the base sequence in a DNA molecule extraneous to the chemical forces at work in a DNA molecule. Now, it took me a while to understand what Polanyi was getting on about, but as I learned more about the structure of the DNA molecule, one day the articles that he had written about this suddenly clicked. And if you look closely at the DNA molecule, you'll see what I finally realized. This is the structural formula for DNA. The sugar phosphate backbone is on the outside of the molecule. The nucleotide bases that store the information are on the inside of the molecule. And the little sticks represent chemical bonds. There was an idea in the 1960s that was proposed that suggested, well, if chance can't explain the origin of life, maybe some kind of natural law-like forces of attraction could. This was known as self-organizational scenarios, or the idea of self-assembly because of forces of attraction producing information in DNA. The problem with that is that DNA does not actually have the kinds of forces of attraction at work that would enable us to explain this information as a result of chemical interactions between its constituent parts. Notice between the A's, C's, G's, and T's that there are no bonds connecting them. Notice also that there's the same kind of bond between the backbone and each one of the bases. It's called an N-glycosidic bond, and it has an amazing property in that it allows any one of those four bases to attach to the DNA at any site, which means that there's no chemical reason as to why one base is one place rather than another. Which is to say that the information in the DNA, which is the precise sequence of arrangement, is not determined by the chemistry of attraction. Now, I have a quick visual illustration that gets this across. Have you ever seen these little magnetic letters that you can put on a refrigerator or a chalkboard, a magnetic chalkboard? I had my wife take a picture of it when I left my visual aid at home. So she took a picture and emailed it. This is, I'm pandering to the local audience here, but here's an information-rich sequence. And there are indeed forces of attraction that explain why the sequence sticks to the median, the backboard here, the chemical backboard, or the physical backboard. But notice that those magnetic forces are not responsible for the sequence that constitutes the information in this little message. And we can prove that the magnetic forces are not responsible because we can rearrange the letters to destroy the message or create a new one. Now, the same thing turns out to be true in DNA. The forces of attraction are not responsible for the information in DNA. So, as we think about the tools available to the scientists to explain the origin of information, chance and necessity, or the combination of the two, as I thought about it, and as I got deep into the literature, I found that there was a reason, some fundamental reasons why all these origin of life theories were failing. And so I began to think about whether or not it was possible that another approach could be taken. The idea that perhaps the information in DNA was the product of an intelligence, of a mind. Intuitively, there's an obvious connection. Bill Gates says that a software program is like DNA. We know that software programs come from programmers, not from wind and erosion or random number generators. So I began to wonder if this intuitive connection between mind and intelligence couldn't be cashed out as a formal scientific theory. And that led me to study the works of, oddly enough, Charles Darwin, because not only was Darwin a great evolutionary biologist, he was a pioneer in the application of a method of historical scientific investigation that allows scientists to investigate events in the remote past. And this method of investigation is sometimes called the method of multiple competing hypotheses, or the method of inference to the best explanation. And Darwin used it and defended this method as being a properly scientific approach to the kind of topic that he addressed. It did raise, however, a question, which was, what does it mean to be the best explanation? One of the lecturers at Cambridge when I was there as a PhD student wrote a whole book on this, Peter Lipton, a book called Inference to the Best Explanation. And it turns out that there are important criteria for determining what a best explanation looks like in science. And many of the 19th century pioneers of historical science had already worked this out. One was Charles Lyell, who said that when we were looking at these events in the remote past, we should try to explain them by reference to causes now in operation. And when I heard that, or when I read that, a nickel dropped for me, because I realized that that was the methodological key to the whole subject. This was the idea behind his dictum that the present is the key to the past, that when we're trying to explain events in the remote past, we should do so by reference to causes that we see operating in the present that are capable of producing the effect in question. And so I asked myself a question. What is the cause that produces functional digital information? What is the cause in our present experience of which we know that can do this? And then it hit me. Of course, it's intelligence, it's mind. And then reading a little bit later, a pioneer in the application of information sciences to molecular biology, I came across this provocative passage. Henry Klausler here said, "The creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity." Is that true? Well, our ordinary experience bears witness to exactly that. Whether we're looking at a hieroglyphic inscription, or a newspaper headline, or information embedded in a radio signal, or a computer program, whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, invariably we come to a mind, not a material process. And so I came to the conclusion that it was possible, using the very method that Charles Darwin had pioneered, to develop a scientific case for intelligent design. In fact, I unpacked that case very self-consciously using this method of inference to the best explanation. Looking at explanations for the origin of information based on chance, necessity, the combination of the two, and finally concluding that only intelligent design had the causal powers, the known capacity to produce information, and therefore when we found information in a living cell and wanted to best explain it by reference to causes now in operation, intelligent design was in fact the best explanation. This is not an argument from ignorance, it's an argument from what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world. Last point is that the main reason that people have offered for rejecting the design hypothesis that I've proposed to explain the origin of information necessary to produce the first life is not scientific. A very prominent biologist wrote me after I published Signature in the Cell and said, I agree with you about all the science. He said, in fact, you have a chapter on RNA world, which is supposedly the cutting-edge idea. He said it's a mess. It presupposes all kinds of pre-existing genetic information. But he said, I'm committed to a naturalistic solution to the problem. And many scientists believe that we must explain things by reference to purely material causes. That's a principle known as methodological naturalism, methodological materialism. So for them, the cognitive landscape looks a little different. Rather than trying to infer to the best explanation, they insist that we must infer the best materialistic explanation. I'm committed to a science that seeks the truth, no holds barred, where we follow the evidence wherever it leads. And so I think methodological naturalism restricts the intellectual freedom of scientists, therefore it's anti-intellectual. I think it's really against the spirit of the scientific enterprise. And I think instead we should look for the best explanation regardless of whether it leads to an intelligent cause or a purely material one. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much to all of you for coming, and thank you particularly for the organizers, Peter and Alexander, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure for me to speak to you on my views on where do complex biological systems come from. Now, to be fairly short, complex biological systems come from God. Fundamentally, everything comes from God. And I think anyone who's a Christian, as I am, believes that God created the world, believes that God designed the world intelligently. I don't think there's any question about that at all. The real question is, how did God do that? And that's what I want to tell you about. And actually, I'm going to do a lot less about science and a little bit more about science itself and more about kind of background assumptions, because I think fundamentally that's what these arguments tend to be in Christian circles. So I'll introduce a little bit about Christians in academy, I'll talk a bit about doctrine of creation, and then I'll talk about evolution and Christian faith. But first a little bit about my own work. So this is a picture of my group, and in fact, is there a pointer somewhere? So One of my advantages, one of the great privileges I have is that my main co-collaborator on the very left there, Jonathan Doe, is also an evangelical Christian. So, and we work together on a number of things, including evolution. I'm very interested in evolution. And I realize that for some of you in the audience, this is a very odd thing. How could two evangelical scientists work on evolution? Does something like that even exist? Wait, where am I in this room? But this is what we are. And actually, I'll argue to you that this is actually much more common than you might think. So let me give you an example of the kinds of things that we work on, just to get some of those things. So this is a virus. Viruses are fascinating little pieces of nanomachinery, little shells of protein that have DNA or RNA inside. You can tessellate them as you see here. So here you see this one can be tessellated as 12 pentagons. This was 12 pentagons and 20 hexagons, which is exactly the way a modern or an old-fashioned football would be stitched. So you see that nature got there a long time before we did. And one of the other interesting things about these is you can take the DNA to RNA out, so you have these little shells. You can put them in a test tube, change the solution condition, and they'll dissolve into these individual protein units, identical protein units, that just float around in the test tube. If you then change the conditions back to their original case, these little things just float around and pop right back into a whole bunch of little balls. In fact, that's the trick that viruses use inside your own cells to make themselves. They use this self-assembly process. And biology is full of things that make themselves, full of self-assembly processes. In fact, just this week, I'm working with a collaborator on looking at the assembly of the bacterial flagella motor. I was doing experiments on them, and I'm doing theory on how that thing actually assembles. And it's absolutely fascinating. Here's an example of something that Jonathan and I have done in our lab. We designed these little viruses, in this case 24 pentagons and 40 hexagons. We let them move around completely randomly, so we don't tell them where to move, they just move around randomly, and if we design them right, what you see at the end is they do indeed perform this amazing, almost magic trick. They pop right into these little tiny balls. And I'm not only interested in the question of how did these things form, but also the question of how did they evolve. So here's a recent picture from one of my students looking at the evolution of the interactions that allows things to self-assemble. These are evolution of self-assembling systems. You see the typical kind of punctuated equilibrium type behavior that's really well known. And what's interesting is we are able to evolve based on our computer systems that self-assemble as you see in nature. And we know that nature does this because viruses evolve all the time right in front of us into new shapes. It's one of the things that makes HIV so hard to treat because it's continually changing by evolution its shapes. So there's no question, I think, among Christians that evolutionary mechanisms are able to do this kind of feat because we see it happening in our labs, and it's an interesting thing to study for that very reason. And I have to say, it's a little bit like what I'm studying is the following. You take Lego blocks, you put them in a box, you shape the box, okay? And if I could just completely solve this problem, then I would become fully formed. I would become very wealthy in the toy market. And so there's no question that science is incredibly fun. Science is a great privilege. And I'm very thrilled that I am a scientist. And for those of you that pay taxes in the UK, thank you very much for the taxes, which funds my work. So this is one of the really, science and nature is beautiful, unbelievably beautiful. And you can ask yourself the following question: what is more amazing? If I give you a fully formed train, or if I design a system that you shake a box, and out comes a fully formed train. Maybe with a few scratches that show you the shaking procedure, but there's that fully formed train. And that's really, I think, a question I want to leave with you. Could God have created everything at once, or could He have created a process that makes things, that make themselves? Which of the two is more glorious? I think that's an interesting aesthetic question. But I want to take a step back first and talk about something quite different, which is, I know for a number of you, particularly those that are not in the academy can seem like this big, godless place. And one of the things I'm very passionate about is helping Christians think biblically about their subjects, particularly students. And so with some other academics at Oxford University, for the last 6 years we've run a course called the Oxford Christian Mind Course. It's only for graduate students, or master's and PhD students. And we have science track, social sciences, history, literature, law, philosophy, and theology. Each of them taught by Christian academics who are at the university or affiliated with the university. Here I show you a few of the pictures. So there you have a large number of Christian academics at one university, Oxford University, who are willing to both be public and take the time to help young Christian students engage their minds in a biblical way. And it's just an important thing to remember that there's not this big monolithic anti-Christian academy. There are a lot of Christians floating around in various ways. And these are all Christians, would be relatively orthodox, believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, etc. And would believe that God created the world and that He designed it intelligently. I also was part of this book that was in the Netherlands, another country I'm originally from, with 22 academics, including some of Holland's most distinguished. The editor was, in a long time, Holland's most cited physicist, called Learned and Believing. And we put this out, not at some cost to some of them. There was a newspaper article that compared us to the Taliban. And so, the point is that there are a lot of academics out there who are strong believers. Here are two friends of mine, in fact, Simon Coy Morris, perhaps one of the world's greatest paleontologists at Cambridge University, a great expert on the Cambrian explosion, who said this in a sermon a few years ago. I'm not surprised at those New Testament miracles reported. I'm surprised that they are so few. What else would you expect when the Creator visits His creation? And here on the right, I have another friend of mine, Francis Collins. I do a lot of work with this organization, Biologos, that he founded to help Christians think about science, particularly evolution. And he talks about his own conversion in his late 20s from atheism to Christian faith. And he was finally pushed over the edge to surrender to Jesus Christ when he was walking in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. And just seeing the beauty of nature around him is what drove him to come to faith. And as you probably know, Francis is the head of the NIH, the National Institute of Health, probably the world's most powerful scientist. He hands out $30 billion a year to scientific research. He was also the head of the Human Genome Project that decoded the human genome. So surely one of the world's greatest scientists, and a man of deep, personal, committed Christian faith. And so I just want to point that out to you, that say that there's a large community there of Christian scholars who have engaged and thought about these things for a long time. And when we talk to each other, how do we think about what we're doing? Why is it actually so much easier to find Christians in science than in the social sciences or in the humanities? For my course, the Christian Mind course, I run the science track. I have to kind of beat the scientists away who all want to speak on my course. It's a difficult thing. For the literature and the social sciences, it's hard to find Christians that want to engage. Okay? And the question is, why is that? Well, it's because science has these deep, deep Christian roots. And there really is because modern science is rooted in the doctrine of creation, the idea that there was in the beginning a God who created the heavens and the earth. And it's deeply rooted in Christology, in the idea, as you see in these famous passages in Colossians and Hebrews, that by Him, Christ, all things were created, and in Him all things hold together. That Christ sustains all things by His powerful word. It's important to remember that when we say that God sustains the universe, it's not like if you were to stop sustaining it, it would slowly grind to a halt. If God were to stop sustaining the universe would no longer exist. And so the question then is, what does science do? Well, you could look further in the Bible and see one interesting way. How does the Bible speak about nature? Well, the Bible uses a very interesting mixed language about nature. Here is one of many, many passages. It's from Amos. For behold, He who forms the mountains and creates the winds. God who creates the winds. So we see that throughout the Bible there are these natural processes that describe both as divine and non-divine actions, two perspectives on the natural world. We see that John Donne, Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, a long time ago already saying, an act of God is so marvelous that only the daily doing takes off the admiration. So really when we talk about science, we're studying the ordinary ways that God sustains the world, the ordinary ways that God keeps the world going. And miracles are not God intervening in the world. It's not God poking into this independent world. It's simply God sustaining the world in a different way. And we know theologically that when God does miracles, He does them for divine purposes, either in history, redemption history, or in our lives. And by and large, the theology for detection of miracles is the theology of revelation. So, for example, when it says that God created the wind, I believe that is true. If I can tell you that the reason why there's wind is because there's a high pressure zone in the north that's pushing and a low pressure zone in the south, and that is why there's wind, I haven't therefore denuded the power of God's creation over the wind. I think that's really important. That's why Johannes Kepler could say, I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him, when he talks about his own discovery of the planets, of the orbits of the planets. For example, the elliptical orbits that Newton famously was able to rationalize with his theory of gravity. So, Sir Isaac Newton, as you know, with the theory of gravity, one of his great successes, early successes, was the prediction of elliptical orbits. But as Newton started thinking about this a little bit more, you can see this, here's the Earth orbiting around the Sun. Gravity works not only between the Earth and the Sun, but also between the Earth and Saturn and the Earth and Jupiter. And so as you start doing higher order calculations, including all those interactions, what you discover is the first order, the planets are unstable. So it looks like the planets are going to fly out of their orbits. So, Newton said, therefore God must occasionally reform the planets. So when they're about to go off kilter, he perhaps sends a comet through, or he does something to reform the planets. Now it's interesting that this was of course done in the early days when people were thinking about science, theologically motivated science, and his great adversary, Leibniz, objected. And he objected on two grounds. One is an aesthetic ground, as Leibniz objected, if God had to remedy the defects of his creation, this was surely to demean his craftsmanship. If God had to reform things, that somehow means he didn't quite make it right in the first place. But more profoundly, I think, Leibniz says, I hold that when God works miracles, he does not do it in order to supply the wants of nature, but those of grace. Whoever thinks of Christ must need to have a very mean notion of the wisdom and power of God. In other words, if God has to do miracles to keep the planets in order, that's not the reason why God does miracles. God does miracles for reasons of grace. I think that's a very profound and important distinction that Christians, I think, instinctively understand, but it's important that they apply that consistently. So when we look at the stars, we see many passages in Scripture that tell us, we look at the stars and it tells us something about God's grandeur, something about our place in His creation. But we know a lot about stars these days, and so there's a well-developed field of stellar evolution. And here you see a graph, not such a clear one. Here's the mass, so these are heavy stars, these are lighter stars. This is time, which is how the stars develop over time. We call that stellar evolution. Stars start and they grow and they go in different ways, and eventually some of them die into supernovas, like for example this famous Crab Nebula, first seen in 1054 by Chinese astronomers. So that's when the light first came to the Earth. And so stars evolve over time. We understand fairly well how stars evolve. We can see stars in different portions of the life cycle throughout the sky. And so the question is, how did God do this? Was this through miracles, or was this through the ordinary ways that God sustains the world, that customs the Creator? I don't think any Christian, I think it's glorious if a Christian can discover how stars develop over time. It's something that brings glory to God. And it doesn't bring any glory to God if we think there has to be a miracle somewhere along the line between this star and that star. So that's, I think, something highly non-controversial in Christian circles. Now I'm going to come to the meat of my next 10 minutes, which is this question of evolution. This is where things get a little bit more tendentious, I should say. So there's a typical picture of the evolution of life. The Earth is formed 4.5 billion years ago. There was this origin of life that happened very shortly after the late heavy bombardment. Most of the time, the Earth had basically microbes. About 500 million years ago, multicellular organisms seemed to appear, and man only very, very recently in that history. And it's not so surprising. The universe is very large, the universe is very old. We know that God likes to take His time to create things, so Christians say, yeah, that's just the way things are. But the way things get difficult is because I think a lot of people, Christians and non-Christians, think that where we come from determines who we are and how we should live. And of course, we know better than that. We know that who we are and how we should live is something that comes to us from God and not from our particular origins. And so the argument is going to be that fundamentally, these questions of how Christians think about evolution have to do with a whole series of complicated issues, under the surface issues, iceberg issues, hermeneutics, theologies, theodicies, problems of evil, in other words, natural theology, and philosophy of science. And my main argument really is that most of the tension in evolution and faith is due to these unrecognized assumptions and the way that they play out in our dialogue. And in fact, if I say the word evolution to you, it's really important that I define what I mean. Evolution is a very polyvalent word, and that's one of the things that makes these discussions so complicated. So people say evolution when they really just mean natural history. They mean something like that graph I showed you, microbes around the Earth for the first 3 billion years, something like the Cambrian explosion happened 500 million years ago, etc., etc. Dinosaurs died out. That's natural history. Then there's evolution as a mechanism that explains that change over time. So we say there has been change over time. How did that change over time occur? And then the typical Darwinian evolution would be say, well, that change over time happened through variation caused by mutations primarily and natural selection. Now, most Christians agree that God created this mechanism. Your own immune system uses a variation, a natural selection type mechanism in order to have a small number of genes that can fight a very large number of attackers. That's because, in fact, as those of you that are physicists or mathematicians will know, anytime you want to solve a high-dimensional problem, a random optimization, a Monte Carlo type algorithm, stochastic algorithms are by far the most efficient. So it's not surprising that God would use that mechanism in evolution. The argument really is the following one. The argument is that is this mechanism sufficient to explain that one? Would the customs of the Creator be sufficient to explain the change over time, or do we need something else? That's really the question. It'd be a bit like looking at those stars that evolve over time and then asking ourselves, are the laws of physics sufficient to explain the stellar evolution over time, or do we need something else? That's what the argument is largely about, particularly arguments around intelligent design versus theistic evolution. Where all Christians, I think, should agree is that there is a real problem with evolution as a big picture, a worldview, scientism, or naturalism. Like George Gaylord Simpson, man is the result of a purposeless and materialistic process that did not have him in mind. It was not planned. He's a state of matter, a form of life, a sort of animal, and a species of the order of primates, akin, nearly or remotely to all of life, and all that is material. Well, this is a purely theological statement that I think has very little basis in science. Richard Dawkins, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind is indifference. What Richard Dawkins is doing here is what we call natural theology. I look at the natural world, I extract from it meaning and purpose, I extract from it theology. And what he's doing is he's saying, if I look at the world, I see something that suggests purposeless and meaninglessness. As any theologian in the room will know, there are lots of subtleties in how you do natural theology, how you interpret the world and extract meaning from it. And really, where Christians should be spending their time, I think, is trying to clarify, trying to cut between that kind of philosophical, theological gloss that people put on all of science, not just evolution, on the natural world, and the science itself. And so, as an intermezzo, again, as an apologetic strategy, for those of you in the apologetics track, I think it's much better to focus on the bad philosophy of evolutionism and other monisms than to focus on the science. If you focus too much on the science, you're essentially granting these people the argument that they're trying to make, which is the science tells you that there is no God. And unfortunately, at least a lot of vocal Christian public debate has had this nature and has therefore helped sustain the conflict myth between science and faith. And I think that has been apologetically a disaster. I think if you want to argue from natural theology, why not use cosmological fine-tuning arguments where the science is largely not controversial, but where the implications of the science are highly controversial? Then it's at least clear where the argument really lies. And if you do want to argue from evolution, then why not use arguments like Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, Sharon Street has a similar running argument against moral realism. These are powerful arguments, interesting arguments that help kind of point at things that really matter. And then, I'm going to skip this. Well, just to say that one of the other kind of natural theology problems that bedevils this debate is that people talk about random mutations, and that in a lot of people's minds, random means purposeless. I just want to make that clear. That is a misunderstanding of the use scientific views. Random means the same as stochastic. It's something that where you may not know the reason why something happens, but it does happen for a reason. And so it's better to think, I think, of evolution as a stochastic optimizer, which is exactly what you would expect if you want to optimize in a very high-dimensional space. A little bit like I showed you in integral plots. Another intermezzo is really how would the church adjudicate on a question like, does the mechanisms of natural selection explain change over time or not? Well, it's important to remember that these are difficult, multidisciplinary questions that need communities of scholars that have time, space, and institutions to think these things through. These are not things that are really going to be solved by popular debates. And it's also important to remember that, among the Christians that I showed you here, and including Christians in this book, and that the Christians that I interact with regularly who are research active at major institutions in biology and who are evangelicals, that really the dominant view, the interpretive dominant view is some kind of version of theistic evolution. This is the dominant view among Christian academics. I spent a lot of time thinking about that. It's a sociological fact, it doesn't prove anything, but it's important for people to keep that in mind. And so in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to finally get to some science and give you just a flavor for what it means. When I say I think it's very possible that God created the biological diversity we see around us through a stochastic mechanism. And that stochastic mechanism may be variation in natural selection, it may be augmented by other processes of self-organization, etc., but it's some stochastic mechanism. What do I mean? And why do I, someone who was brought up in the evangelical background, change my mind from thinking that evolution was probably quite dodgy to thinking that actually there's an awful lot of pretty strong evidence? I'll give you an example. This is from a friend of mine, Dennis Venema, a Christian biologist, who also blogs a lot at Biologos. So let's look at whales. One of the arguments is that whales came from land-based animals. And so the question then would be, how would we find evidence for that? Well, you could do genetics, you could do comparative anatomy, you could do fossil record, you could do embryology, and we could ask ourselves, evolution in fact makes predictions about roughly how each of these would look. And so I'll look at them really quickly for you. So look at the fossil records. Well, the hypothesis is modern whales descended from ancestral terrestrial organisms. So the prediction is that we should see in the fossil record, or hope to find, something that preserves forms and that is ordered in time, from things that look like this, that are somehow land-based, and then over time we should start finding things that become more and more look like they're also water-based. We also see things like we see over time, we see nostrils that start at the front of the skull as we do, and over time those nostrils should move towards the back. And quite recently, there's been a number of interesting discoveries. For example, this particular fossil is made. This has taken a while to find because, in fact, the place where these fossils are found is in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which, as you know, are not the easiest places to be paleontologists. But they have been recently found, and what they notice, for example, is in fact that the nostrils start moving further and further back along the skull, and that there are legs. There are still little legs left, but they sort of atrophy. They become very small, and not very much of them is left. Until finally you come to the modern whales where those legs are in fact entirely gone. So that's one prediction that the evolutionary number 2 makes about natural history, number 1. It says if there was that change over time, which we postulate to be true, we would expect there to be a sequence of these fossils and expect that sequence to have a particular temporal order. We might expect there to be something in embryology as well. So when we look at embryos, because a lot of these animals share body plans over time, you might see something. You see indeed, I've seen this recent paper from a few years ago, that that cetaceans or whale-like or dolphin embryos show something very similar to four-legged creatures like ourselves. They start to form buds in the same kind of program that look like they're from behind legs. Then a bit further on the embryology, those things basically drop off. And that is the kind of thing you might expect if there was a stochastic mechanism that twiddled with a body plan to form new structures. It's evo-devo. The kind of thing you might expect would be to say, well, other types of embryology. So one of the interesting things in these little dolphin embryos that they actually start by having nostrils that develop close to the front of the nose, like we do, like land-based animals do, and eventually, during the process of the embryo developing, those things move up to the top of the head, to the blowhole portion. So again, this is it suggests from embryology, so as well something that resembles the change over time by stochastic process of whale evolution. And then we can make more hypotheses. So if in fact whales did originate from land-based animals, we should find in their DNA things like genes that we use in terrestrial life but are not needed underwater. We should see remnants of those genes. And so here's a recent paper that looks at whale genes. And for example, whales have a different, you look differently underwater. There's a different way of seeing. And whales indeed have inactivated genes and inactivated smelling genes, olfaction genes, which we as terrestrial mammals all share. That's again exactly the prediction that evolution makes, and it's a prediction that's actually seen in nature. And finally, you can compare it to anatomy and physiology, and just look at how these things compare. And again, as I showed you, there's a lot of comparisons that suggest that whales came from land-based animals originally. So what you see here are typical evolutionary type arguments. You say, well, I think that this is the sequence in which these things happened. I make some predictions of how things work. We do a whole series of predictions, and it weaves together in quite a tight tapestry. There are lots and lots of ways this could go wrong, and it more or less coheres together. It doesn't tell you exactly how it all happened. There are still many gaps in how it happened, but it's one of many, 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 many stories that cohere in this particular way. And so we say, does this look like God used the customs of the Creator in order to make some land-based animals to create whales? It does. Does this denude God's power or God's creative activity? It absolutely doesn't. No more than in understanding stellar evolution denudes God's power or God's creativity over the world. So that's basically what I have to say. I introduced you a little bit to Christians in academia, just to hopefully give you some heart and help you. I think this is an important question for all of us, to how we engage the next generation of Christian scholars. I talked about why I think there are so many Christians in science, because science is based very deeply, has deep historical roots as well in the doctrine of creation. In fact, I would argue that it's really hard to derive anything like the scientific method without assuming as a starting point the divine will and purpose behind the world. And lastly, I talk about evolution in Christian faith, and I try to explain to you why many leading Christian scientists like Sam Cohen-Morris, like Francis Collins, like many other people that I mentioned to you, believe that it's very likely, most likely, that God created the different changes we see over in time through an evolutionary process. Thank you very much.
Art's presentation, and I think he and I share a lot in common. I watched a presentation he made about miracles online. It was very good, explaining the difference between God's primary action and his in miraculous intervention and his ordinary way of upholding the laws of nature. And I also agree with his understanding of the importance of the Christian faith and the foundation of modern science. Notions like the laws of nature are actually a very distinctively Christian idea, a biblical idea, in fact. There's a great deal of scholarship on where that idea came from, going back to the book of Job. And so it isn't surprising that there are so many Christians in science. And I was encouraged there were even some believers at Oxford. Having been at Cambridge, we had the opposite view. So it's an old joke, right? And I also very much agree with the idea that the laws of nature are a mode of divine action. In fact, that was a lot of what Newton was arguing with Leibniz about. And so those are some points of strong agreement. And I'd like to point out some areas of divergence as well. Actually, one other thing, in that I think that Art frames this discussion about origins helpfully as well, when he says, are the laws of nature that we see ordinarily at work, or mechanisms that we see at work, like the mutation selection mechanism in the case of biological evolution, are these sufficient to explain what we see in the natural world, or is something else required? And I think that's a helpful way of framing it, because there are some things that we see in the world where those laws or ordinary mechanisms are sufficient. I think that viruses that Art studies is a great example of a case where there are self-organizational processes at work. The stereochemical affinities between those proteins and their structure allows for this amazing kind of jigsaw puzzle fit into things to actually assemble in real time right away. Okay? But there are a lot of other things where those kinds of self-organizational law-like processes do not explain what we see and what is present in the natural world. And one of the central things that law-like processes do not explain is the origin of information. I had another slide that I would have shown, but remember my illustration with the magnets. It turns out that information is inherently aperiodic. Here, let's look at this guy. It's something that is non-repetitive. Imagine a third string on this slide here, where the string is OM. Okay. In information theory, that would be regarded as a redundant sequence, highly repetitive. But it could also be generated by a simple algorithm or law. The problem with trying to explain the origin of information is that information is inherently aperiodic. Laws of nature, by definition, describe patterns of repetitive order. Sunrise, sunset, all unsuspended bodies fall. Okay, repetitive patterns. That's what the laws of nature do. Information is not that kind of a beast. And for that reason, the attempt to explain information by reference to self-organizational processes analogous to those that Art correctly invokes to explain viruses do not work. And so in that particular case, and I like the way he frames this, are the laws of nature sufficient to explain what we see, or the origin of what we see or not? In the case of the origin of information, there is a clear, definitive, and categorical answer: no, they're not. In fact, this would be a category mistake to explain the origin of information by natural law. To the extent that something is law-like, it's redundant, not informational. Redundancy faces information content. So this is just, it's a non-starter. And it's one of the reasons that I think the argument for a discrete intelligent action as opposed to the ordinary concourse of God upholding the laws of nature is necessary to account for the origin of information. Now, I want to go a little bit further than that as well, because in the question of biological origins, which I didn't get to discuss, I think there are also very serious issues with respect to the creative power of the standard evolutionary mechanisms that are on offer. The standard one is the mutation selection mechanism. And I will talk about this a bit in my afternoon talk in the Science Network. But I think it's very important, just as it's important for Christians to embrace the best science that we have, it's also important for Christians to be appropriately skeptical about claims that exceed what the evidence shows. And one very strange phenomenon, which I have, very interesting phenomenon, which I've described in my next book, Darwin's Doubt, is that there is now a huge disparity between what public spokesmen for contemporary neo-Darwinian theories say in public about the theory, about its status. Richard Dawkins is famous for saying, if you doubt neo-Darwinian evolution, you're either stupid, wicked, or insane. Eugenie Scott in our country of the National Center for Science Education says there are no weaknesses in evolutionary theory. All the major science organizations have public statements that they've issued saying there are no controversial elements to current neo-Darwinian biological evolution. But when you get into the technical peer-reviewed literature in biology, you find that leading evolutionary biologists are now calling for a new theory of evolution because natural selection acting on mutations is understood not to be sufficient to create the origin of fundamentally new forms of life. Major book, MIT Press, 2004, collection of essays, including one from Simon Conway Morris, who, by the way, says we are in a post-Darwinian world. This collection of essays, The Origin of Organismal Form, Two leading evolutionary biologists write an introductory essay. They list unanswered questions in biology. One is the Cambrian explosion, the subject of my next book. The other closely related question is the origin of biological form itself. They say neo-Darwinism is still the canonical theory in biology, but it has no theory of the generative. It can't explain, it does a great job, others have said neo-Darwinism explains the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. It doesn't do a good job explaining the origin of form itself. Now in my afternoon talk, I'll explain why there's several reasons the mechanism fails. One of them does relate to something Art said. He said that in the case of whales, this is a great example of evolution. Well, maybe it is evolution in the sense of change over time. But I have a colleague, Richard Sternberg, an evolutionary biologist who was at the Smithsonian and NIH, who's now with our lab at the Biologic Institute, who has done a population genetics analysis and an anatomical analysis on whales. There are literally hundreds of anatomical innovations in whales. One very sexy one is the whale testes. In most organisms, in most mammals, the testes have to descend from the body cavity. Mostly guys here, but there are some mixed companies, so I'll be as discreet as possible. And that's, the sperm has to be kept cool. So whales, they're aquatic mammals, you don't want those things dragging in the water, so the creator put them inside the body cavity. But that creates a problem, warms up the sperm. But an anatomical innovation exists in aquatic mammals. It's a counter-current heat exchange system. It works on the same principle as a radiator. It's a fascinating, complex adaptation. And there are dozens of these in aquatic mammals that do not exist in the presumed land-based common ancestor. Why is that interesting? You do a genetic analysis on this. You start making calculations using standard equations of population genetics about population sizes, generation times, and mutation rates. And the calculations that Sternberg has made suggest that it would take 43 million years to generate 2 coordinated adaptive mutations in the whale line. Just 2, but there are hundreds needed. So it's one of many reasons for doubting the neo-Darwinian mechanism, because the standard population genetics ways of that is, the neo-Darwinian math is population genetics. You plug the figures in for most of the major evolutionary transitions, and the neo-Darwinian math is showing that the neo-Darwinian mechanism lacks the creative power necessary to generate these major anatomical innovations. So I think just as we need to be aware there are lots of Christians in science, and that's good, we also need to be aware of false consensus in science, and to be aware that even secular evolutionary biologists are questioning what many Christians are saying, hey, we have to accept so that we'll have credibility in the secular world. Not sure that's the case, so it's a cautionary note there, and I've used too much time also.
I think one interesting point that you made, Stephen, which I agree with, is you quoted Dawkins, who said, if someone tells you they don't believe in evolution, they're either ignorant or possibly even wicked. And what he's essentially doing, and the way a lot of his rhetoric goes, is as follows. Here is evidence from the geological record for change over time. That's evolution. Evolution means there's nothing but blind pitiless indifference. And so they're using scientific arguments for evolution, number 1, natural history, and saying that these are the same as the arguments for evolution number 3, which is a kind of naturalist take on the world. In fact, it's a pretty naive naturalist take on the world. And I think it's really important that we expose that at every point. And so when somebody says there's a lot of evidence for evolution, I always say, whoa, what do you mean? Right? Do you mean natural history? Well, it's pretty overwhelming evidence for natural history. Is evidence for evolution, for stochastic processes over time in the change? I think it's pretty overwhelming. But what exactly happened from A to B to C, there's a lot of things we don't know. And it's important to keep that clear. I think what's also interesting is that we're realizing this argument we're having, or if there is even a debate, is really one about science. And then the question is, how do we adjudicate these kinds of things? Well, the way that the community of scholars should adjudicate these things is by thinking about them long, by having experts spend their lives studying various aspects of this. And it is a sociological fact that a very large number of Christians who study these things think that something like evolution, like natural selection, explains pretty well the change over time. But maybe they're wrong, maybe everyone's wrong, maybe Stephen is right, and we've all been wrong. And I think it's important not to say, well, it's not science, therefore we can't do that. I think we should think about these things and see whether we can find counter-arguments. And so the point really is one of the things I think has been unhelpful is that a lot of this debate has happened effectively in public, often by people who are not experts on this, and I think it's unhelpful and both apologetically and often pastorally for people to engage this. But I think it's also an unfortunate aspect of the modern evangelical church is that we don't really have the kinds of institutions in place where these things, trust institutions where these things can be properly worked out. Having said that, let me just give you a little bit of a feel from why the kinds of impossibility arguments that Stephen is giving often don't have a lot of traction in the academic world. And part of that is a sociological argument. So here is Evelyn Fox Keller, a famous physicist turned biologist turned philosopher. All right, so it's not working. So the point, this doesn't matter too much because I can do this by explaining. The point is that, so she gave an argument for, in your class on dimensional analysis, which you engineers will understand. You say, if you've got a speed and you have a length, then you can extract a time from it. And at the end, one of her students raised his hand and said, excuse me, ma'am, how do you know that's true? Have you done the experiment? And the reason for basically that skepticism is what I tried to explain to you, that biology is full of surprises. It's tremendously hard in biology to say a priori this couldn't have happened, that could not have happened. You have to do you have to search through all the possibilities that there could be. And biology is continuously surprising us in all kinds of different ways. Let me give you one example. A protein, as you saw, is made of amino acids. If I have a whole bunch of amino acids in a row, right, then I can ask myself, how many different configurations could that protein have? Well, if I say at the first order, there are 5 angles between each one, I've got 5 times 5 times 5 times 5, I really quickly get the number of configurations that a protein could have is so large that it will take longer than the age of the universe to search that space. And this is famously called the Leventhal paradox, a paradox that suggests that there's no way that you could search through all the configurations of the protein to find its final state. Proteins, nevertheless, continuously do fold right into this very unique ground state, one of a gazillion different ground states. And the question is, how do they achieve this amazing feat? Because it seems impossible. The combinatorial explosion of possible states is unbelievably big. And the reason they achieve this state is because there's a mistake in the way that argument is formulated. It's not the case that proteins randomly search in space. Rather, there's a guided search, a funnel-like search. It's just a naive way of thinking about search. And that's why proteins are able to fold. We know it's true because we see it in front of us. And so analogically, you can make similar kind of arguments about the combinatorial explosions you see in evolution of time. So if I got my computer to work, I would have shown you some work that we've recently done on folding of evolution of RNA. So let's say I take a length 15 RNA. Okay? RNA has 4 possible bases at each. Right? So there's 4 to the power 15, 2 to the power 30, a billion different sequences. And the question is, how on earth could you ever find an RNA in those billion multiple sequences? Well, I could look at one phenotypic thing, which is the shape. So RNA is folded into particular shapes. And then there's 431 shapes. That makes life easier. As if I assume that I just want to find a shape that's the probability 1 in 431. But then I ask myself, how are these shapes distributed over that space of a billion sequences? And it turns out that just 26 of them take up 50% of the sequence space. So if I just grab a sequence at random, I've got a 1 in 2 chance of getting one of these 26 most common ones. And so I've gone from a billion to 1 in 26. What's interesting is we've looked at a lot of RNAs in nature, and they're all very much biased towards those very easy to find states. That explains why in an experiment you can take a random RNAs, called static experiments, and you can find things like the hammerhead ribozyme, which is an active a catalytic RNA, again and again and again, with a very small number of random things, because the search is not random. The search is highly structured. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because biology is full of these kinds of surprises. You can say, well, it couldn't possibly happen because I made this combinatorial argument. But once you start understanding a little bit more about it and getting into details, it turns out that it has all kinds of clever ways of getting around our impossibilities. And that, this is the last thing I'll say, that is in stark contrast to fine-tuning arguments in cosmology, where we can do the counterfactuals. It's because physics is much simpler than biology. So if I give you a fine-tuning argument in cosmology, say the resonance in carbon is just at the right energy to allow stellar nucleosynthesis to make carbon, oxygen, etc. The reason why that's a powerful argument, why it's not a contested argument, is because I can show you what happens when those levels are up and down. I can show you what the combinatorial space looks like. I can show you that this thing that we see is in fact rare. So, is it true that these combinatorial explosions make it impossible for evolution to find things? We don't know yet. But we're so far away from ever knowing. It's such a complicated question. We're so far away that I think really we should take a step back and allow the community of scholars to engage in this and think about these things and see where we come before we try to use it in public or even in apologetics.